Miss Farr, you're muted.
Good morning and happy Wednesday. Welcome back. I'm Miss Farr from Cambridge High School. Sorry about that. I just realized I had my mute button on. But wanted to say thank you to all of our viewers and for everyone who has been tuning in. Before we get started today, kind of talking about manifest destiny and sectionalism, I wanted to apologize to those of you yesterday for viewing. I realized that when I was talking about Jackson and I was talking about the election of 1824, I kept saying the election of 1820. And I think that many of you kind of caught that and had mentioned that on Twitter. So thank you and appreciate that. As a teacher, I am human and we all make mistakes. And the number one thing I've always believed in as a teacher is to apologize and hey, and say thanks to you guys because that means that your teachers were doing their job, that you were able to kind of pick up on that. And also kind of use it as a teachable moment that that is something that could possibly happen to you when you're writing your DBQs. You could be possibly putting in a year and you could put in the wrong date, but the information is correct, but the year is wrong. And it'd be a classic example as a reader where we are taught when we're looking at the read to kind of disregard the wrong information and look for the right information. So while the actual information I was providing was correct, I just had the date wrong. So again, I apologize for that. And also, if you weren't able, I put the correct link in there. I'm not sure what happened with the ABCs of period 4, but I made sure to share that proper link. So if you're unable to find it, I will post it on Twitter once I am done. So let's just kind of go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about manifest destiny and we're going to talk about sectionalism. And so we're going to always start up with a warm up. All right. So very quickly, we're going to talk about point of view. So look at this and remember, look at all of the details. And the question that I left off with you guys yesterday was what would be the impact of manifest destiny? And I talked about Native Americans, I talked about farmers, and then I talked about Mexico. And so when you're looking at this picture and you're seeing manifest destiny, we're going to talk about the definition, how it kind of came about, why we decided to basically settle, and then, of course, about the forgotten individuals that were living on this land. So, when you're looking at this land, first of all, you'll notice that the people in railroads, how they have money. So, that's kind of a indication that it's a lot about capitalism and economic gain, people kind of going out west in order to look for economic opportunities, businesses trying to grow. You can see the people up top saying it's a land rush. So, kind of giving a clear indication that, there's a need for more land, people wanting to acquire that land. And so, because there is nothing left for them over on the East Coast, the only thing that made sense for them was to kind of go out west. People saying it's a new start, cheap land for me. So, we call those push and pull factors. For those people, a push factor would be something like, I was bankrupt. I was in debt when I was over here on the East Coast or in the South or up north. So for me to go out west would be a pull factor because it's a new start. And then you'll look over here and you'll notice that there are some Native Americans that are NTPs, and they're sitting there and they're seeing all of this coming, and there's fright there because that was kind of unexpected. Because up until this point, the federal government not really making a deal with Native Americans, but it was just they just kind of left that area alone. And before the Louisiana Purchase, the French weren't thinking about settling there. They were just thinking of, again, kind of going in during fur trapping season and then leaving. So the Native Americans that were living in this territory were pretty much kind of left to their own devices. And then you have this guy here who is, one of the people who live down in Mexico. Remember, they've already gained their independence from Spain. And so now they're kind of concerned and they're saying, should we be worried? Because now that you notice that this train is coming this way, is there a possibility that, this will move down south? So, depending on who you speak to or would have talked to, Manifest Destiny's point of view could have been seen very differently from many different groups of people. For these groups of here, there's the thought process of, we're worried what's going on, we're about to be kind of even more isolated off. And for everybody else, it was kind of seen as a good thing. So we're going to jump right into it really quickly and kind of go over our overview. So we're in period 5 now, and we're going to touch on manifest destiny and its impact. And what we're basically doing is we're kind of paving the way and leading into the events that will lead us to the Civil War. And then we're going to talk about sectionalism. So we're going to look at the causes and effects of westward expansion. Why did we feel it was necessary? Why did people feel like it was needed? And then, of course, the effects of immigration from various parts on culture. So we're kind of looking at the fact that we do have different groups that are coming in. Mr. Horton kind of mentioned the fact that you did have a massive group of Irish that kind of came in due to the potato famine. And then out west, we do have Asians that are coming in from different territories, and they're kind of coming in and kind of settling on the West Coast. So continuing on with the skills, we're looking at developments and processing and also sourcing and situation. So we're going to continue to kind of work on those DBQ skills as we move along. All right, so very quickly, we're going to kind of show you this video that will give you the introduction of Manifest Destiny and kind of give us an overview.
There was an ancient belief that empires always grew westward. Many Americans had come to believe their country's push west was unstoppable. They call the idea Manifest Destiny, and it seemed to be working.
The Louisiana Purchase made Americans much more aware as they moved into the farther reaches of the territory of what else was out there.
The Americans believed that they were destined to expand across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans and to control the continent.
Suddenly, more lands that had belonged to European powers fell into American hands. The powerful Great Britain again gave way to the feisty young republic, giving her portions of land which would become parts of present-day Minnesota, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, as well as states nearer to the Pacific coast. America would also defeat Mexico, grabbing areas of present-day Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, and states farther westward. During the same period, tens of thousands of Americans, braving deadly hazards, would push through westward routes like the Oregon Trail. The difficult journey would claim many lives, yet wave after wave of pioneers would continue to cross the Louisiana Territory en route to their promised lands. Their motivation? Dreams of pristine land, abundant gold, and a new way of life. By the early 20th century, America had secured for herself all the territory of the present lower 48 states. But the United States might look very different today had the Louisiana Purchase never happened.
The Louisiana Purchase is arguably the most significant foreign policy initiative by any American administration.
Well, it added almost half of the territory of the United States to the new nation at a bargain price.
It set the foundation ultimately to expansion all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
The Purchase helped transform the United States from a seemingly irrelevant country and experiment into a powerful country.
So, how important was it? It's impossible to exaggerate its importance.
The Purchase had been a noble bargain, but it would also send America on a difficult journey. With this unprecedented land transfer came exhilarating expansion for some and difficult displacement for others. America had survived threats from powerful empires, while she would face major divisions within herself. But the golden thread binding the Louisiana Territory to America had been the Mississippi River. And just as this wet sojourner begins as a trickle, yet becomes a mighty wash of water, America had started small and grown large and strong. Ultimately, the Louisiana Purchase had unfurled an incredible history, allowing the nation's expansion while capturing the world's attention.
All right, so let's talk about Manifest Destiny. As the video kind of gave a brief overview, it was a mission. It was seen by many as, kind of like the idea that we should settle from ocean to ocean. The theory of needing a little bit of elbow room. At this point, they had pretty much colonized all the way over into the Ohio River Valley. And then, of course, with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, that really kind of set the precedence for people really kind of want to go out into that westward expansion. Although they had not explored that territory as of yet, that thought process that America should continue to expand and grow as a nation, feeding that hunger, was always present. And so it was kind of like an idea that the United States had believed that it was its mission to extend its boundaries. And it says boundaries of freedom. And of course, what we're going to realize is that not everyone who was in America at that time actually had those boundaries of freedoms. And so Also the idea that there was theories that there were people out there who were unable to self-govern themselves. And of course, they're looking at specifically like Native Americans and if any Mexicans that were living in the United States at that time, but also kind of sharing the idealism that if you're unable to self-govern yourself, hey, we know about democracy, it's working for us. Why don't you guys kind of come in and join in with what we're having. So they basically thought that God had planted that seed in them. And so it was their God-given right that they should stretch from ocean to ocean. And so once the Louisiana Purchase kind of took place, it just kind of it was like a domino effect, as you kind of saw at the end of the video. So here is one of the most famous pictures that kind of indicates manifest destiny. We're going to look at it and kind of practice a little DBQ. So if you were given this as one of your documents. It's called American Progress by John Gass in 1872. And it wants to talk about what would be the impact of manifest destiny from 1800, let's just say from 1820 to 1848-ish. I'm just kind of giving you some dates, throwing them in there. All right, same thing. What you notice in the very first political cartoon is basically evident here. You do see technological progress. You do see this is like the angel of destiny. She is moving forward. Here, if you notice in her hand, she has the lines kind of talking about the technology. So basically, we're kind of talking about communication lines. Remember, we looked at something yesterday with that last political cartoon where we're talking about the telegraph, things like that. You see the steamboats back here, there's in the water. You see the movement of the railroads, so the expansion of railroads. You see the impact that it is making. And then you see here farmers and soldiers and frontiersmen, they're kind of coming through. They're kind of going here. There's a miner. So clearly you're looking at the evidence that you're about to have the gold rush that's about to come up as well. You see buffalo that are kind of running away. Remember that they were allowed to roam free, which is why Native Americans were in that territory, because that was one of their main food sources. You're seeing the beginning and opening of farmings. But of course, as all of this expands, you're going to notice that there's going to be some close off. There's going to be some gaps. There's going to be some confusion, because the frontiersmen that will actually love this land and was, herding buffalo and things like that, they're going to find themselves being closed off as well. And then, of course, Native Americans, they were kind of left to their own devices. They were allowed to be in that territory. They were kind of left alone. And now, once again, you see that the Americans are kind of pushing them even further. So it's getting to the point where they're not going to have anywhere to go. And the government is going to have to deal with the task of, what are we going to do with these Native Americans? And remember, they were forced that way under Andrew Jackson with the Indian Removal Act. So they were already forced to move out west, and now they're going to continue to be pushed even further. And so when it says American progress, the progress we're looking at is just the expansion. So if you were to kind of talk about this is so many things, like just some of the things that I listed in here that you can kind of gather from this picture. You have the economic advances, you have the technological advances, and then of course you have the social. There are some advancements there as far as certain social classes, but of course they're kind of closing off the gaps. All right, so what were our main reasons behind manifest destiny? Well, number one, let's always think population increase. And I said, leave the edible room, meaning that they had pretty much expanded as far as they can go. Families were getting bigger. Down in the southern states, the need for large plantations was there, so they needed to have more land. You also have to remember that we have went through two economic depressions or panics. Remember, we had the Panic of 1819 that happened, that kind of ended the era of good feelings, and then you had the Panic of 1837. And so now people who either lost homes or lost money during either one of those panics decided that they needed to have a fresh start, and that going out west was going to be the way to go. You also had the abundance of cheap land or free land. Out west. There were some government programs that encouraged people to kind of go out west and settle. And so right now they're going to be considered territories. And then of course, what's going to end up happening is the federal government is going to provide them with guidelines and how those territories can actually become states. The idea of expansion into new commerce, kind of looking at people who are owning railroads, the individualized privatized railroad companies and how they're trying to come together, which will eventually lead to one of the biggest projects where we're going to connect basically the East Coast and the West Coast. And if you can figure out what I'm talking about when we're trying to make that connection, that's a question for Twitterverse. What major project is kind of going to be underway as it pertains to the beginnings of Manifest Destiny? See if you guys can figure that out. And then, of course, we're going to have trails that are going to start. The Santa Fe Trail, where people are going to kind of go into uncharted territory, and then the Oregon Trail. And I'm kind of showing my age a little bit, but as a kid, I remember being in school that was actually one of the games that we played when I was in elementary school called the Oregon Trail, where we were settlers who were trying to go out west, and the idea was to make it and see if you can prosper. Sometimes you made it, sometimes you didn't, but it was actually a cute little game. So you can probably maybe ask some of your teachers if they remember playing the Oregon Trail. All right, so as Manifest Destiny, the ideas start to continue. There's going to be one president in history besides Jefferson. So Jefferson will probably be given credit for starting the idea of Manifest Destiny. But if there was a guy who they say put the man in Manifest Destiny, it's going to be James K. Polk. He basically served one term in office. He served from 1845 to 1849. And he really kind of put that ideology of kind of continuing on. So where Jefferson kind of left off, Polk is going to pick up. So basically, he's going to be responsible for acquiring the rest of the territory that will kind of put the whole idea of Manifest Destiny into place. When we are going to go through a series of incidences, it's going to happen as a result of Manifest Destiny. It's not going to be easy transition. We can't just move into territories that are already occupied. We're going to have Native American battles. We're also going to have the Mexican-American War. Because again, trying to continue on with that theory, we're going to kind of, try to finish that up. But in 1848, this was probably one of the biggest acquisitions that James K. Polk is going to be up in this territory. Here we're trying to finish off because up here with our northern borders of Canada, you do have like Oregon and Washington and Idaho. This will continue for the territories that were up there. And so once this kind of starts, the idea is that we want to continue and kind of look down south. But the problem was when you think about Manifest Destiny, all this territory where California, where Nevada, where New Mexico, Arizona was actually the property of Mexico. And so now we're trying to figure out is how do we acquire this property as well? And so that's going to end up being some of the territories that are going to be underway when we look at the Mexican-American War and how we're going to continue to kind of bring the United States into fruition. And so the results of Manifest Destiny are not going to be good for everyone. And so here's another depiction of Manifest Destiny. And so take a few minutes and kind of think about what you're seeing here. And very quickly, I wanted to give shout outs to Miss Mixon at Bishop McLaughlin. Her students wanted her to know that they have been on watching us live and they miss you and they're very thankful for you. And also Mr. Kaplan and Miss Guerra from Suffern in New York. Your students think that you are wonderful A-push teachers. So it looks like, our colleagues that are in these different states that are kind of going through it, your students are very much so showing you love. Okay, so if you were looking at the point of view here, it doesn't look very good as far as Manifest Destiny goes. It's really kind of what the author is trying to do is really kind of get you to draw on the sympathies of the impact that Manifest Destiny is having with Native Americans. Here you see women, you see children, you see the elderly, you're seeing them basically forced and being packed up. Look at the background of it, kind of giving that grayish depiction that they're kind of going into despair. And so while, yes, Manifest Destiny may have worked for some people, it did not work for all individuals. And those were those things that the people in the federal government or sometimes ignoring because of, the idea of spreading out was more something that they were looking at. They weren't looking at the impact that it was having on others. And then also, too, you could replace these with farmers. Think about it. Eventually, what they're going to find out as a result or impact of Manifest Destiny is that all of that farmland that they once had is actually going to find it being closed off. It's going to be shut down as the expansion of the railroads are going to kind of come out. Frontiersmen who started these long cattle drives that are going to start once we acquire territories like Texas and things like that, you know, they're going to find themselves kind of being closed off too as an impact of this. And so it's going to have its positive and it's going to have its negative impacts when you kind of think about it. All right, so remember I told you guys about James K. Polk kind of putting that in there. So this is the last piece of land. This is known as the Mexican Cession, and this kind of ended at the end of the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican Cession allowed us to acquire the territories of California. Then you have Nevada, Utah. You're going to end up getting with New Mexico and Arizona. And so all of this kind of happened after we ended up fighting the Mexican-American War. We actually helped Texas gain their independence. They're going to kind of be left to their own devices for a little while. So they're going to kind of sort of be an independent nation because we hadn't actually allowed them into the Union as of yet. But then eventually we will acquire and annex Texas. And so we needed to kind of finish this off. And so once we actually acquired this during the Mexican Cession, and again, this is at the end of the Mexican-American War. Some territories we paid for, some of it we just kind of took it as, you know, kind of at the end with the treaty. Then what's going to end up happening is that there's still a small little portion. We're trying to figure out our borders and we're trying to figure out exactly how far should we go. And so there was a portion where they were looking at the Rio Grande, which is actually going to be the border that kind of separates Mexico from the United States. And there was this little small part right here that's going to be known as the Gadsden Purchase. And this is going to be extremely, extremely important. Because this is going to kind of help us with that big project for that question that I asked you guys on Twitter, which is at the end of Manifest Destiny, what major project is the United States going to take to kind of connect the East Coast and the West Coast? And so right here, once this is acquired, remember now the issue is, what do we do about slavery now that these new territories are coming out? Because up until now, Mexico had actually outlawed slavery. It wasn't allowed. And then what's going to end up happening is as these new territories are coming in, remember the 3630 line under the Missouri Compromise said that anything south of that was going to be a slave state. Anything above was going to be a free state. So now there's kind of like an imbalance of power inside of Congress. And so now what you're going to end up seeing is the rise of sectionalism as a result of this. I left a QR code down there for you guys if you want to scan it. That is actually a very cute little thing kind of talking about the Mexican Cession with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase. It was a Tonight Show kind of bit that they did. We can't show it here on YouTube Live, but when you guys get an opportunity, please go take a look at it. It's actually very hilarious. All right, so now here's another issue, slavery or not. And so when we talk about sectionalism, this is basically one of the biggest things or policies that we had to kind of think about with slavery. We got to look at when new territories come in, do they still fall underneath what happened with the Missouri Compromise? And then also too, kind of looking at what happens if the people who live in those territories don't want to participate in the act of slavery. According to the Missouri Compromise, they should be a slave state if they live below that line, but what will happen if those people decide that they don't want to do that? So this is going to be a huge issue, the idea of permitting slavery into these territories. And so a congressman by the name of David Wilmot is going to end up with the Wilmot Proviso. And basically what he says is, let's just ban slavery in any new territory acquired from Mexico. They didn't practice slavery in the first place. These people don't even know what the policy of slavery is. And it is going to be a huge issue, especially for the southern states, because again, the issue of slavery was all about the balance of power. And that was one of the things that the southern states feared, is that there was too much power that's going to be put into the northern states that eventually they're going to kind of get away, they're going to end their way of life. And so it did actually pass in the House of Representatives, but the Senate basically took it down. And so what they basically said is that we got to figure out something else, because up until this point, you know, the Missouri Compromise was working, but what they realized is that there were some setbacks to the Missouri Compromise, because what they found out was that a lot of slaves realized what the Missouri Compromise meant, and also what it meant if they went north. And so you're going to start to see a lot of slaves that are going to try to escape and basically become fugitives and run into areas like Ohio or Illinois, into those states, and actually start to acquire new lives. And so eventually what's going to end up happening is that the Supreme Court is going to actually step in. There's going to be a very famous court case that basically says that it doesn't matter if you are a slave and it doesn't matter if you are a slave and you live in a free state. If you are considered to be a slave, you are a slave no matter where you are. It was the Dred Scott case. It was a case where Dred Scott, his basically his first owner had passed away, and he was basically the property of the wife. The wife sold Dred Scott and his family over to a brother. The brother and his family owned Dred Scott. They lived below the 3630 line. They moved up into a free state, and so Dred Scott was thinking, well, since slavery is actually prohibited here, technically I'm no longer a slave. And basically what that said under Dred Scott was that no, you are going to be property no matter where you are. In addition to that, they're going to create what are called fugitive slave laws, which basically says it is illegal for certain states to hold runaway slaves, that it is their duty to return that property back to its owner. And so this, of course, is going to be a huge blow or setback to the abolitionist movement, because one of the things that they were trying to do when they were helping slaves escape was to kind of put them into the position where they can actually be living in the United States, but live in, the free states. So eventually what's going to end up happening is there's going to have to extend, and they're going to try to move as many of those free blacks or those runaway slaves from, especially after Dred Scott and the Fugitive Slave Acts were put into place, they're going to move them up north into Canada. And so also you have an issue with another state that's happening. So while all of this is happening and the battles are kind of on the foregrounds are going between the North and the South, you have another problem. You have the state of California. You have a lot of immigrants. So we talked about immigration, and you have a lot of people who are coming here from Asians that are coming in from different territories. They could be from China, they could be from Japan, they could be from many different areas that are coming here for the same economic opportunities that most immigrants come from, that came here from America. But they came in on the West Coast. And so, that's going to be a pull. And then, of course, in the late 1840s, gold rush is really going to happen, and you're going to start seeing people really make that mad dash out there. They're going to be known as the 49ers. And then, of course, as more and more the population starts to build up in California, the idea of it becoming a state, when it became to petition for statehood, is it going to be a free state or a slave state? Because ironically, when you look at the Missouri Compromise and you look at that line that was drawn, there's a small, teeny, tiny portion of California that is above, and then the rest of it is below. And so what do you do when you have a state that's kind of being split in between? How do you make that decision? So one of the things I wanted to kind of show you guys was something about the Fugitive Slave Acts, and really kind of talk about the impact that we'll have and how it's going to lead even further into sectionalism. So here we go.
In the 21st century, the reverberations from the arrival of the first black slaves to the Jamestown colony in 1619 have not subsided. The greatest failure of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is that they did not end slavery. In fact, the Constitution began a process that would nearly tear the country apart. The northern and mid-Atlantic states understood the hypocrisy of fighting a war of freedom and at the same time owning slaves. By the end of the Revolutionary War, those states had abolished involuntary servitude. But the southern states had no qualms about continuing slavery. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina defended the South's peculiar institution warmly.
In all ages, 1/2 of mankind have been slaves.
John Rutledge of Virginia was more direct.
North and South Carolina and Georgia would never agree to a new constitution unless their right to import slaves be untouched. The people of those states will never be such fools as give up so important an interest.
The southern plantation owners realized that northern states would become safe havens for runaway slaves, and they demanded a provision in the Constitution that required northern states treat slaves as criminals to be extradited back to their state of origin. Article 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution declared that persons held to service or labor, a euphemism for slavery, in one state escaping into another shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. However, the Constitution did not set up a mechanism for carrying out the law. The result was that in 1793, Congress passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act that outlined how Article 4, Section 2 would be executed. Although the law was largely ineffectual, it began a process that would split the nation apart 68 years later in the Civil War, that would be the bloodiest war in American history. Though the war's outcome would cement the nation back together, it did not end the schism between North and South, black and white. A schism which still haunts the United States today.
And of course, schism, of course, is a great divide. And so basically what you're looking at is that you had fugitive slave laws that were in place. And then as time continued and expansion happened, and especially with Manifest Destiny, you're going to see the need for more stricter fugitive slave laws. And then eventually the Fugitive Slave Acts are going to kind of come into play. So we're still debating, we're still trying to figure out what to do with the issue of slavery. We're still trying to figure out the idea of sectionalism, because the North and the South are clearly identified, but of course, the West is still kind of coming into their own and really trying to figure out how those states are going to operate. And so what you're going to have is the issue of the Great Compromiser, otherwise known as Henry Clay, versus the Great Nullifier, or John C. Calhoun. And you remember him. He was the first vice president underneath Jackson, who was in this situation with the nullification crisis based on the tariff that Jackson had put into place. And so you had a debate that was happening between the Great Compromiser and the Great Nullifier. And the issue was what to do about California. Should it be a free state or should it be a slave state? Basically what he was saying was this, let's California come in as a free state, but, let's have a little bit more robust federal fugitive slave laws in hopes that, this will kind of create that whole divide of sectional compromise. And what the Southern states were saying is no. If California should possibly come in as a free state, then that might throw the balance of power off. And so again, it angered him, John C. Calhoun. He thought that, that wasn't a good resolution, that we're not actually following the policies that happened within the Missouri Compromise. And so John C. Calhoun says, look, slaves can run away. They can go into different territories. They're already been running away to free states thinking that they're free. We need to have more stricter policies, more stricter laws that basically just says, you know what? You need to return slaves. They should not be allowed to stay in these free states. And that if they're a slave in the South, they're going to be, and they move up north, they're going to be a slave up north. Like, it should not matter. There should be no limitations to where slavery actually ends. So how does that happen? And so what you're going to start to see is you're starting to see the Southern states really start to show their anger. Their way of life is being challenged now by the North, and they're feeling like, eventually what's going to end up happening is that the Northern states are going to try to overpower them and take over and eventually abolish slavery. And so their economic way of life is going to kind of discontinue. And so as we think about Manifest Destiny and kind of thinking about sectionalism, and we're still kind of talking about it, there are a lot of consequences, and I kind of mentioned a couple of them. But I wanted to kind of make sure that you guys really, really understand and really kind of think about the impact it would have if, in case you were ever given a DBQ question about Manifest Destiny. So think about this, Polk, of course, being the man who put the man in Manifest Destiny, he embraced it. He acquired new territories and pretty much kind of finished off with that, that whole idea of the God-given right to settle from ocean to ocean. And of course, with the acquisition of new territories, will become, a negative consequence, of course, is there's going to be heightened tension between abolitionists and slaveholders. Because what you're going to see is as more and more people are moving into these territories, you're going to have free soilers who are going to say, no, there should be no slavery. And you're going to have the pro-slavery group who are saying, hey, screw you guys. I have the right to own slaves if I want to. I'm out here for my economic prosperity. Let me do let me mind my own business. And especially if we were below that Missouri, the 3630 line. You also have to look at the idea of the tension between the North and the South, their battles, the balance of power inside of Congress, the idea of whether or not to admit the free states or the slave states. And of course, that in contention with the fact that you also have various Native American battles that are happening as people are starting to settle off. These Native Americans are tired of being displaced. They're tired of being overlooked by the federal government. They have been lied to continuously over and over again. And so now the federal government, in addition to dealing with the battles between the North and the South and whether or not the issue of slavery should be allowed or not allowed, they're going to have to deal with Native American battles as well. you're going to have groups of Native Americans who are basically going to start to resist. And so they're going to kind of start their own lands. And then eventually what you're going to see is as these Native American battles are going to be suppressed, and they're going to continue even well after the Civil War, eventually you're going to see Native Americans, the civilizations are going to be pretty much decimated, and they're going to be basically relocated and forced into various Native American reservations, especially like in places like Oklahoma, and they're going to be all over the place, South Dakota and other different territories. You also had that big debate with the Wilmot Proviso, and the fact that, John C. Calhoun did not agree with that. He really wanted to have tougher laws, whereas, with Henry Clay, he wanted to admit with the state in as a free, but have some flexible laws in order to kind of basically satiate that whole need for, what to do about the balance of power between slave states and free states. The Proviso strongly said no, like we don't want to have we don't want to allow these new territories to come in and be slave states. And you're also going to kind of look at this. This is going to lead to other laws being put into place, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We're going to talk about one more compromise that's going to happen, that's going to kind of basically nullify the Missouri Compromise. If you can guess it before I get there, please tweet your responses to Mr. Horton. And I think you guys did guess that the Transcontinental Railroad is the big project that I'm talking about that's going to connect the North and the South. And Liliana Aris, I was told that you once again got it correctly. And so one of the things that you have to think about, the idea of manifest destiny and us becoming the United States and kind of unifying and becoming a strong nation, that was the theory. However, it's actually going to end up causing more tension, and it's going to lead to an intensifying sectional conflict. And basically, we're kind of laying the road or the foundation on our way to the Civil War. And so I really, really, really want to kind of make sure that you guys really kind of understand. A lot of people assume that sectionalism actually started, especially during this time, like right after the end of the American Revolution, when the North and the South are really kind of coming into their own. But sectionalism actually started well before then. When you think about it, sectionalism really could have started during the English settlements. Remember, we had the southern colonies, we had the middle colonies, and then we had the northeastern colonies all the way up in there. So, where the Pilgrims, and each one of them had different reasons for why they were settling in different areas. And so, again, you could see kind of like the stark differences as you look into those different regions. Even when the 13 colonies rebelled, you can kind of see that there were differences. Some, colonies didn't want to join in. Some of them kind of felt like, we're kind of in the middle. So we really, really, really don't want to kind of be involved with this. And so, again, even after they rebelled and they declared their independence in 1776, sectionalism is still evident, but it's probably not going to be as dominant as it was until after Manifest Destiny really kind of took its place. But, again, while the North was becoming more industrially advanced, really wasn't heavily dependent upon forced labor. A lot of indentured servants had kind of faded off, especially when you got the end of international slave trade. There's going to be a lot of tension. And so, the Constitution pretty much had to address that, especially down South when it came to population. And so, again, you do have the Compromise of 1820, which is the Missouri Compromise. And then, of course, it's going to be replaced by the Compromise of 1850. And even then, there's still like that tension. It's kind of like both the North and the South are kind of standing on a plate of glass, and you can see the cracks kind of coming. And it's like, okay, eventually that glass is going to break and it's going to come crashing down. And that's what again, they were trying to prevent by trying to put these laws into place and prevent a civil war from happening. And so one of the biggest things with the tensions with sectionalism is always about, economic policy, especially with the federal government. How do they feel? Are they promoting more agricultural, the agrarian society that was in the South? Are they leaning more towards the manufacturing society, which is up north? Again, in the fact that you have both the North and the South, both vying for land out west. Basically, the idea of future economic opportunities. Remember, I kind of talked to you guys about the Southerners wanting to have bigger plantations spread out. They need that. The Northerners are looking at, let's go out west, let's build factories. Both of them are trying to suppress, their path to social mobility, especially down South. Social classes and all that type of structure was a little bit more structured down South than it was up North. A lot of that kind of went away. And then also the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that even though their ideologies were different, A lot of Northerners didn't object to slavery. Like, you know, they thought about the idea as like, okay, you guys want to own slaves? That's your prerogative. We're not saying completely abolish slavery. Those were abolitionists who wanted to abolish slavery. So I want people to kind of understand that not everybody who lived in the northern states wanted to end slavery. They honestly could have cared less. Their idea was, we want to go out west, and we want to make sure that if we are more so along the lines of manufacturing, that's what our focus is on. So if you want to remain an agrarian society based off of slavery, that's fine, as long as that doesn't infringe upon what I'm trying to do. And basically the southern states are saying the same thing. As long as what your ideologies are doesn't infringe upon what I'm doing. So you can kind of see how that clash is going to kind of like the bumping of the heads. It's like, you know, neither one of them were wanting to destroy their way of life, but they also didn't want the other way of life to inflict upon them. And then I mentioned to you guys about the free soil movement and about how, you know, they were enticing people to go out, and the free soilers were there basically saying no to slavery. And then, of course, a pro-slavery group is going to go out there and they're going to kind of have some clashes. And then, of course, you're going to lead to what was known as like a lot of different series of skirmishes. One of them, Bleeding Kansas, is going to end up happening. And so now what you're looking at is, who has the power in the federal government? Is it the Northerners or is it the Southerners? And so the growing sectionalism that we're talking about here is preservation of economic way of life. Industrial North, agricultural South. And so lastly, we're going to kind of talk about what they thought would be a good idea to kind of keep the tension down. The Compromise of 1850. This is basically going to nullify the Missouri Compromise. You had a lot of new, stricter fugitive slave laws that basically says no matter where slaves run away, whether they're in a free state or a slave state, they are required to assist with the recapture and return of the enslaved person and basically bring them back, or you can pay a substantial fine. They even required ordinary citizens to actually assist in that. That did have a lot of negative consequences, because you did have a lot of Blacks who were actually free, who were never slaves, who found themselves actually being captured and brought back and forced back into slavery. So you're going to have to kind of think about that as well. Another thing was, remember we were talking about California, what to do with that. The Wilmot Proviso, even though it passed in the House, was knocked down in the Senate. They came up with this compromise of 1850, which basically says, yes, California can be admitted as a free state. And we're going to kind of balance it out, because we're going to have these fugitive slave acts that are going to be put into place as a concession if you allow California to come in. And so the southern states are saying, okay, that's fine, but you know, if as more and more territories to petition for statehood, how is that going to be decided? Well, it's going to be something known as popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty basically says this: the people who live in that territory have a right to decide for themselves if they want to be a free state or a slave state. So, popular sovereignty, there you go. So now you remember the free soilers and the pro-slavery groups that are going to come in, they're going to start clashing heads again, because now they're starting to go into these territories and they're trying to get enough votes so that either they can ban slavery or they can keep slavery. And so now you're going to look at, and this is going to be especially important when we're talking about New Mexico and looking at Utah. And then the other big thing was that because the capital is in Washington, D.C., the federal government does not want to be seen as taking sides. They said no slave trading inside of D.C. Slave trading. They did not say no one could own slaves. So while the anti-slavery advocates, they welcome the ban of slave trade, they need to understand that slavery itself was not banned. And so now what you're seeing is we have now laid the foundation for what will be the road to the Civil War, because this compromise is only going to satisfy people for only a short period of time. And you can see the tension. It's like you can cut the tension with a knife. That's how thick it was. So let's do a little bit more guided practice. So we're going to look at the intended audience and purpose of this. So take a few minutes and kind of see what you got here. This is going back over stuff that we just talked about. All right, so you see, this is talking about the Compromise of 1850. Here's Henry Clay, the great compromiser, and he is just exhausted. The puzzle pieces that you see here are these territories that are kind of coming in that are petitioning to be slaves. Here is your infamous 3630 line for the Missouri Compromise. What do we do? How do we make a decision? So who would be the intended audience and what would be the purpose of this? Well, the purpose of this is just kind of talking about the fact that the Compromise of 1850 is while it did help ease some of the tension, it basically kind of showed the inefficiencies of what was going on with the Missouri Compromise. It also kind of looked at the idea that these new territories, how there's still going to be an imbalance when you look at this. So you have a lot of states that are coming up here, but some of these territories have not yet petitioned for statehood. So that means that the balance of power may kind of sway itself more to the southern states versus the northern states. And of course, with Henry Clay is this compromise is only going to be lasting for so long, so he can't keep doing this forever. So if you saw this, and it kind of talks about, again, going along the lines of the impact of Manifest Destiny, your intended audience could be considered to be either group. Because basically what he's saying is there is no true way to really satisfy and for everybody to come out of this where everybody's going to be in agreement. Like, look at these pieces. You can't put the pieces of the puzzle together. Like, the idea is for us to operate as one nation, and we're not doing this. And there's still that small divide. And so even look at the sign where it says slaves freed north of this line. Even look at where it's sitting, you know, here. And so what he's basically saying is that we cannot keep making these compromises. We're going to have to come up with something that everybody is going to be agreeable or amenable to. And what we're going to realize is that there is no true way to agree with this. And you also can look at the fact that this is really kind of showing you how sectionalism is existing and how it's pretty much going to end up setting the stage for the future of the Civil War. All right, so let's do a little bit of checking for understanding. Of course, this is the Free Soiler movement. We kind of talked about this. So I'm going to give you a few minutes. You're going to use this image and your knowledge about U.S. history to answer one of the questions. And you only have to look at it once, but I'm going to give you some possible and responses to both. So if you were going to look at this, which one would you use this cartoon to best help you explain? Would it be territorial expansion, states' rights, or attempt at political compromise? So take a few minutes. All right, so you see this, forcing slavery down the throats of a free soiler. You can see here are the people who are basically for, or, you know, they could be depicted as Southerners or Southern senators or congressmen, depending on how you see it. You can see them pushing him down into, this is the free soiler here. And then of course he's saying murder, help neighbors, help, oh my poor wife and children, which is indicating that they actually already forced his wife and his kids down the throat of a free soiler. So this is kind of depicting the tension that's happening between the pro-slavery groups and the free soilers. And if you really kind of look at the background here, even in the background, you can see the tension that's there. Somebody is being lynched. And then over here, you can look at Cuba, you can look at Kansas and the Democratic platform. So of course, this could be even a depiction of something that, you know, kind of an idea of what was happening inside of Bleeding Kansas, which is how it's got its name. So here are some possible answers that you can talk about. So if you were going to mention expansion, of course, you're kind of talking about the idea of admitting Kansas to the Union at the expense of the expansion of slavery is wrong. And of course, they're talking about the Democratic Party. Remember, how do you know that? Because it says Democratic platform right there. So remember, when you're looking at political cartoons, especially in the DBQ, make sure that you pay attention to everything that's happening and pay attention to all the words. So that way you can make sure that you're kind of getting exactly what the picture is trying to say. And kind of using it as a tool for a slave conspiracy. Let's say if you were going to argue the idea of states' rights, which is what the Southern states were basically arguing for. The Democratic Party was subverting the individual choices of the citizens on the frontier and attempting to facilitate the expansion of slavery contrary to the wishes and votes of local citizens in the region. So basically what they're saying is that even though there's popular sovereignty and even though people are saying they don't want to have slavery, the Democratic Party is pretty much the one who's kind of forcing that idea down there. And then if you're looking at attempts for a political compromise, how would you argue that? You could say that the actions of politicians and policies of one of the major political parties leave very little room for compromise, since anti-slavery citizens are sort of captive audience and constituency of these politicians and policies. So again, this is thinking using your knowledge as well as what you see in the cartoon to kind of help you do an analysis of how you would be able to answer that question. So let's just kind of go through this. Key takeaways. Think about the positive and the negative things and the causes and effects when you look at Manifest Destiny. Think about the rise of sectionalism. Also kind of thinking about as Manifest Destiny is happening, remember that we do have a large group of immigrants that are still kind of continuing, influx of immigrants that are still continuing to come into America, and also kind of participating in Manifest Destiny as well. Think about the intensified expansion and the deepening regional divisions that are about to happen as the North and the South continue to kind of butt heads, especially as economic prosperity and political prosperity is happening out West. Also kind of, again, thinking about all of these different communities that are happening, how they're trying to settle over into the West, into the East Coast, but then they're actually made to move out further west. Those cultures are clashing along with Native Americans. And so you have all these different immigrants that are kind of coming in, and they're having to figure out and adopt their way of life. They may not have believed in slavery, but at this point, they're having to make a decision of, am I going to associate myself more with the North, or am I going to associate myself more with the South? And of course, we talked about the causes and effects of westward expansion, and then we're going to kind of look at the effects when we talk about immigration too. Look at what happened to Mexico inside the Mexican-American War, how their way of life pretty much had kind of changed. And then the two, as you have this Asian population that's coming over and settling inside of California, and you're going to kind of see that trend and transition as we kind of continue through with period 4. And so we have one final thing we're going to do for exam practice. So here is your DBQ question. You're going to briefly, or here's a part of a question. And remember, one of the things we mentioned to you guys is before sometimes you read the document, sometimes what you may want to do is read the question and kind of come up and see if you can come up with your own thesis statement or ideas, or kind of make that jot list as you're thinking about what the question is asking you. So explain why the Compromise of 1850 of the following developments was the most significant factor contributing to the outbreak of the Civil War. So thinking about that, thinking about the Civil War and what you know, kind of take a few minutes and think about how you would respond to that. So here's something that you could possibly say. By undoing the Missouri Compromise and allowing the possibility of slavery in Utah and New Mexico territories, the 1850 Compromise effectively demolished a fragile truce between the North and the Southern sections of the United States. And the fugitive slave laws also inflamed Northern anti-slavery passions. So again, this is just reading the question, thinking about it, thinking about what you know, what the compromise did, what it was intended to do, and of course, what it actually ended up doing as you're looking at the outbreak for the Civil War. So something to think about for tomorrow. You will be back with Mr. Horton. What was the most important cause of the American Civil War? Think about things that we talked about today, because that can also kind of help you as you respond to that. And really quickly, shout out to Isabella Olivares for answering that question about the various acts that kind of came in as a result of, kind of meeting the Compromise of 1850. Again, thanks you guys for joining us. And also very quickly before we go, I know somebody mentioned they wanted to get an ABCs of period 3. I will work on that and post that on the Twitter page for you guys tomorrow. So thanks for joining me. Have a great day.